Madam President.
Senator from Texas is recognized.
Madam President, I'd ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be dispensed with.
We're
I gather from the parliamentarian shaking her head, we're not in a quorum call.
That is correct.
Thank you very much. Madam President, since last March, state and local governments have received about $500 billion in federal funding to bolster their fight against COVID-19. Leaders in my state have used this funding to cover the mounting costs of expenses at the start of the pandemic. It enabled them to stand up testing, increase bed space for ICUs and hospitals, and provide grants to small businesses without the fear of cutting other critical services. As time has gone on, the battle against this virus has shifted, and so have the needs of my state and our local communities. Many simply don't have the continued need or even opportunity under the guardrails Congress imposed to spend this money within the set timeline. That's especially true in some of the rural parts of my state or places where COVID numbers are thankfully low. Qualifying pandemic-related expenses are few and far between in some of those places, as strange as that may sound here in Washington, D.C. I've heard from state and local leaders who are frustrated by the strict rules on the funding. They have needs, but somehow the limitations that Congress has put on their access to the money are stifling their ability to deal with priorities that they have at the local level. They're able to use these dollars on some of the tough financial dealings of the pandemic, but not all. And one of the greatest needs they have is to deal with infrastructure. When folks hunkered down at home to stop the spread of COVID-19, state and local transportation budgets took a big hit. As a result, many infrastructure projects ended up on the chopping block. In 2020, states and cities across the country delayed or canceled transportation improvement projects totaling about $12 billion. Many of these projects are still in limbo. Without sufficient funding, there's no timeline when that planned construction might actually begin. For months now, there's been a clear need to bridge the gap. Back in March, nearly 36 organizations wrote to Treasury Secretary Yellen, urging her to make transportation infrastructure an eligible expense. They said the pandemic had impacted every state and community differently, and they wanted and asked for flexibility. They said that flexibility will be critical to ensuring funds are used expeditiously and with maximum impact. I've gotten the same sort of requests from the people I represent in Texas, so I drafted an amendment to this legislation to provide that flexibility. Thankfully, I found a partner in Senator Alex Padilla of California, and our bipartisan amendment will ensure that, which will, I believe, when we vote on it, receive broad bipartisan support, and I'm hopeful we can vote on that amendment sometime later today. But this amendment puts decision-making power at the local level and gives these leaders more flexibility to invest in the most critical projects for their communities, whatever those might be. In some places, that may still mean pandemic-related expenses. The Delta variant has thrown us a curveball, to be sure, and it's surging in some places, and leaders in those areas are going to continue to use this funding to bolster the fight against the virus. But this change doesn't interfere with those plans in any way, because what Senator Padilla and I have proposed is to make that strictly an option, not a mandate, but an option, so that local leaders at the state and local level can decide what fits their particular need. It simply gives states and localities that aren't facing a mountain of COVID-related expenses the ability to invest this funding in, you guessed it, infrastructure projects, something that the bill we are currently considering is designed to do. But one of the things I've noticed since I've been in the Senate is frequently we will appropriate money, and it takes not just months, but sometimes years to get to the intended beneficiary. I know the presiding officer has seen with me the fact that we have appropriated $46 billion for to prevent evictions from people who can't pay their rent. And yet that money has simply not made its way to the intended beneficiaries in a timely and expeditious way. Hopefully that will improve. But this is money that is available immediately to our local and state officials to use now. This infrastructure bill is to the credit of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Negotiating Committee, I think has some good, very positive elements to it. But the truth is, what we are doing in this bill probably will not flow quickly to local jurisdictions in our states like the money that they already have but are handcuffed from using for infrastructure purposes. Whether it's widening highways, constructing bridges, extending railways, or expanding access to broadband, the list of new qualifying expenses is a long one. As I said, there's simply no requirement they spend a penny on infrastructure if they don't want to, or if they think they need to hold more of this money that the federal government has appropriated in reserve. All we are doing is simply giving them the freedom to use these federal dollars on these projects if that makes sense for these communities. Senator Padilla and I have worked with our colleagues to make some changes that support a vast array of infrastructure projects. We added additional qualifying infrastructure projects to ensure unique but no less important needs in the various states are eligible. The White House initially raised concerns about the amount of funding that we might authorize under our amendment and worried it could take away from necessary COVID-19 expenses. Well, Senator Padilla and I have worked with the White House, and I believe we've come up with a good faith resolution of their concerns and our interest in getting this money to be available. Under our amendment, up to 30% of the unspent COVID-19 funds would be available to the states and local government for infrastructure projects. It's difficult to quantify exactly how much the money will be spent on infrastructure projects because, as I said, the states and local governments are not required to spend a penny of that money on infrastructure. But should they wish to do so, and should local conditions permit, this will open up tens of millions of dollars for infrastructure projects in communities across the country. This can help critical projects that were delayed by the pandemic get back on track and put this funding for its intended purpose, the very purpose we are debating right now, to both alleviate the financial burden of the pandemic on cities and states, as well as to refurbish and expand our critical infrastructure, including broadband. So this isn't just a win for our local communities, it's a win for taxpayers too. Here's something maybe a little unexpected. The cost of this amendment is zero. It's nothing, because the money's already been appropriated, it's already been scored on previous COVID-19 relief acts. All it does is it removes the handcuffs from those local jurisdictions and allows them to meet their local needs based on their best judgment. So this does not increase the deficit. This does not add to the debt. This amendment's been endorsed by more than 24 organizations representing a diverse set of stakeholders. The National Governors Association, which, as you know, is a bipartisan group of governors, have endorsed this amendment. The U.S. Conference of Mayors and a long list of organizations have thrown their support behind this common sense change. This will give communities in Texas and Nevada and all other states the ability to use pandemic relief funding when and where it's needed most. They know the needs of their communities far better than we do sitting here in Washington, D.C., and I hope this amendment will be adopted to give these leaders greater decision-making flexibility. I want to thank senators on both sides of the aisle who've worked with Senator Padilla and myself on this amendment. And later today, I hope we will receive a broad bipartisan support for this amendment. And I anticipate we will, because I know the circumstances in my state dealing with my constituents is really no different when it comes to giving flexibility and access to those federal COVID-19 dollars, that the story is probably largely the same, whatever state you represent. So, Madam President, with that, I would yield the floor, and I would note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.